capitalism as we know it is bankrupt. This crisis period starts in 2001 with 9/11 and the attack on the World Trade Center, and following with the Patriot Act and the war on terror. And really, this is the first time that I think Western society in general realizes that the social contract is now sort of broken, and the capitalism and prosperity is not capable of keeping people safe in a globalized, interconnected world. And we move on from there to the financial crisis in 2008, which, and more particularly the response to it, delivered a commercial liquidity boost. This pumped money into big business while getting everybody else, the working people, to pay for it, to suffer austerity so that the big money system could continue on its merry way. And now we're looking at 2020, and we're hoping against all hope that this is the pivot that we're waiting for, and that the world doesn't have to get a lot more terrible before we cop on to ourselves. But if this is the pivot, our big question is what are we pivoting to? And we have three choices. We can pivot to our destruction. We can pivot to just merely surviving, or the thing that we're all trying to achieve here. We can pivot to a thriving for the planet and for the people on the planet. And when you start to try and weave the history of economics into all of this, and where we are now from an economics perspective, you start with the traditional economic model. And in the traditional economic model, people's savings is the money supply. And the money demand is business wanting that money in order for entrepreneurs and business to produce more stuff. And it's this stuff and the creation of stuff that's the real economy. And since World War II, for the last 80 years, this economy has been a consumerist economy. And in consumerism, you have endless exploitation driving endless GDP growth. But everything changed in 2008 in ways that are very damaging and very scary when you start to break them down. You have this crash, and the stock markets start to put pressure on governments, and they start to put pressure on banks, which start to put pressure on governments, which sees governments go into the red, sees society starts to feel the brunt of this economic collapse. And the government's response is quantitative easing. The government's response is to print money. And in printing this money, what it's doing is it's pumping liquidity back into these banks that told everybody that they were too big to fail. And the idea was that these banks would distribute this money across the system, and they did, but they did so unevenly. They gave it to big business, and they pumped money into large corporations, which saw the liquidity of large corporations go through the roof. And now you have organizations that have cash in the bank, finding it cheaper to take this free money that's been thrown at them. And what do they use this money for? Do they pay people's wages and invest in creating more stuff that people consume in the consumerist economy? No, they don't. And the fact that they don't invest in good jobs and wages means that consumer sentiment collapses. It means that the demand for stuff also collapses. So we find ourselves at a position where the real economy is in tailspin. The real economy is in a serious negative feedback loop. What they actually spend their money on is buying back their own shares. And buying back their own shares inflates the price of their shares, which inflates the value of the stock exchange. So they're taking this free money and they're buying back their own shares, and they're creating this bubble on the stock market. And those with savings are looking at this and seeing a return. So they're happy because financial markets are experiencing a positive feedback loop. So you've now got this increasing divide where financial markets have never been stronger, and yet everybody below that is suffering more and more, and inequality is going rampant. And when financial markets are on the increase, that means asset prices are increasing. That means it's more expensive to buy real estate. It's more expensive to buy a house. And with the real economy in tailspin and less good jobs, people's ability to pay is continuing to decrease. So this is a very serious problem for real people every single day. And what it does in essence is it turns the financial bubble from 2008 into a whole economy crisis. So what happens if we take this system and continue into the pivot, which is what even the best of these Green New Deals is using this system to pay for new technologies. If we take even the best of these systems into the future, the best we can hope for is somewhere between destruction and surviving. If we're really going to get into a position where we can thrive, then we have to come up with something new. We have to come up with a new way of operating this whole model. Unfortunately, we have the power. We, the people, have 4 levers in this system. The first one is most of the savings in the system is built on the pensions of ordinary working people. So we control or can influence what's done with the savings. One of the key drivers is income tax, and we get to vote. And the big lever that we have is our spending. We can choose what we consume, what stuff we spend money on, which in turn defines the revenue that big business gets, which dictates the interest on the savings. So this model allows us to map out a landscape in which people can thrive. When you take that particular landscape and get businesses to invest in better wages, and you take the corporation taxes, you have an economic model, a real economy that is capable of managing itself and thriving. There are other institutions in this space that are optional, that may or may not be of value to us moving forward. The banks, Wall Street, shares, and that requires a lot of deep questions about property and the protection of property. And then there's the actors in the system that really need to be made obsolete or need to be taken in hand. And that's the oligarchy, the elites that are controlling way too much of this dynamic. In our overall model, each of these elements are the institutions in our system, and arguably old style businesses fall into that as well. And this landscape of people thriving is the space for our cellular economy. And our cellular economy model in this context is there to help the system of capitalism to democratize, to take back the power in the system away from the oligarchs and back to the people.